Hi, folks. Eric from Hit Subscribe here, and I am doing yet another edition of our freelancing Q&A where I answer. I think that's self-explanatory. Anyway, it's mostly questions from beginner to intermediate freelancers. At least that's kind of what's shaped up in my backlog over the years. I'm still working my way through. I think like I'm caught up to maybe like 2020 from reader questions. It's a slow burn here, but you should all keep asking questions so I don't eventually run out of content. But anyway, my backlog of questions happens to be mostly skewed toward the beginner to intermediate side of freelancing. And every week I pick a question out from the backlog to answer. Having lumbered through that explanation, let's get into today's question, which is basically, it boils down to, is kind of a lengthy one that came in over an email, but it is, should I gain some kind of leadership experience before freelancing as a programmer? A lot of my questions do come from the programming world, since that is where I come from. And this one, of course, does. But I think this can be broadly applicable to other sorts of technician-style freelancers, so like graphic designers, copywriters, etc. I don't think that this is necessarily unique to programming per se, although it is sort of interestingly intense in the world of programming. So let me first summarize the question here. It was an email, several paragraphs long. I'm not going to read all of it, but basically the person was saying they're a senior software engineer. And before, the eventual goal that this person had is to go independent. But prior to doing that, they're thinking that they want to assume a more strategic role, perhaps within their organization, like a dev manager or something like that, where they're not just kind of cranking out code. And the person writing in thinks that they would be better suited to have experience that's more like systems thinking, strategic thinking, etc., rather than just software development labor and like cranking through Jira tickets or whatever, the way that a lot of senior software engineers will. So the concern this person had was essentially with the way that the onboarding process would work for them as a freelancer, if going off on their own. So like, would there be a subject to like, developer quizzes on Upwork or whatever people do to qualify in those venues? So the gist was coming from the world of being an individual contributor that's like pure technician. I'm borrowing that term from the E-Myth Revisited, but it basically means an individual contributor that does essentially labor. Like that's the nature of what you do. You come in every day and write code, or if you're in a different kind of role, you come in every day and do graphic design, or you write or whatever. That's what I'm referring to as a technician, maybe as opposed to somebody who is in a managerial or leadership position or who's an entrepreneur, those being the other two archetypes in that book, technician, manager, and entrepreneur. So this person is saying that breaking out of the trenches of being an individual contributor, senior software engineer type is difficult, and asking essentially which of two paths that he should follow. Is it going independent first and kind of doing labor as an independent and then trying to graduate from there to a more consultative type of offering, which is a thing that comes up in my channel a lot? Or do you try to earn a promotion at work and become more like a dev manager or somebody in leadership and then go off on your own? And given that this is somebody who's following my content, that was my path, by the way, is that I ascended the org chart into organizational leadership before becoming a consultant. So the question is, which of these two routes should the person pursue? Now, I do want to mention something here that is more specific to software engineers than it will be to other flavors of technician. The world of software engineering is just comically gamified when it comes to software engineers evaluating each other's skills. Now, any technician heavy labor, people get pretty into like this idea of meritocracy. So like, are you a good photographer or graphic designer or copywriter or whatever? And in organizations, typically, if you're going to hire somebody to do salaried work in one of these types of roles, or if you're going to hire someone to do freelance work, which is really more or less the same thing, just kind of different onboarding or whatever. So like staff augmentation freelance work where, as far as the organization is concerned, the difference between like a freelance copy editor or a salaried copy editor isn't a whole lot in terms of the work that they're doing. It's just that the paperwork that you're doing to employ them is different. So the way that this happens, whether it's through freelancers or bringing on salaried folks, is typically the organization's management will do some kind of interviewing of them, and then they will either directly as part of the interview and grading process of some kind of submission, or indirectly kind of behind the scenes, they'll involve other technicians to grade that technician. Meaning, let's take a hypothetical copywriting role. If you're hiring someone to be a content creator, you will probably enlist content creators that you already have on staff to kind of grade the skill of this content creator you're thinking of bringing on, whether that person is a freelancer or you're bringing them on salaried. So that's pretty standard. I don't care for that. I don't think it, but then again, I also am kind of an iconoclast here. I would honestly abandon the entire job interview process if it were up to me. So I have unconventional views here. I don't want to go too far down that rabbit hole. What I am trying to say here is that of all of the technician flavors of doing that, which is kind of every individual contributor labor across the board, in the software engineer world, for those of you who are not in software engineer world, it is just like an order of magnitude stupider than in most situations. Software engineers love nothing more than getting together and judging other software engineers and saying like, oh, you should pay them less because they don't like this design pattern. This, I've written at length about this. That software engineers, you can just kind of let them go to town on each other, negotiating each other's pay all the way down, while organizational leadership sits there kind of bemused looking on and saying, oh, okay, I guess if you feel like we should not offer them as much money because they don't know this design pattern, sure, fine, whatever. If you want to witness this, go and look for their sites like HackerRank and Coder Joust, or I don't know what they're all called, but they're literally like job interview sites that are devoted to this exact pursuit, which is being incredibly judgmental and gamifying software engineers around their skill sets. So I'm mentioning all that to set the stage in this video for the idea that while some of the dynamics of this question will apply to everybody out there in the broader world, I have never seen a set of individual contributors that are as much kind of bogged down in this type of like grading of applicants as software engineering. It's absolutely out of control. So when this person is saying that it's really hard to get out of the senior software engineer world and into management, it's way harder in engineering than anywhere else, because you have this whole layer of like architects and tech leads and all these people that aren't really organizational leadership, but are kind of organizational leadership and view it as their absolute duty and charter to kind of grade harshly all possible applicants and entrants into this organizational leadership world. So understand that going in. This is maybe less of a pressing issue if you are a photographer, whatever. So anyway, that's a lot of caveating established here in advance, but it's important to call out because this is a challenge. So let's look at the two paths that you can consider here. So you want to go from an individual contributor software engineer that's having a tough time getting out of the sort of grading network of software engineers, and you want to go to an end state where you're more of a consultative, independent freelancer consultant. You could either get promoted in your organization and then kind of do, this is what I did, like earn promotions and be in organizational leadership and then go off on your own. So that's path one. Path two would be you just leave as a senior software engineer, go into freelancing, and then kind of work your way into a more consultative flavor of freelancing. So maybe there's a third path, but I can't think of it. So those are the kind of the two that I can think of. And I'm going to break down each one of those. So first of all, what are the decision factors that would be at play in this? I want to get that out of the way first as I talk through, kind of your path, depending on which one you choose to go. So one of the decision factors here would be how much runway do you have? So let's say that you've saved, a year's worth of expenses in the bank, and then you're about to go off on your own as a freelancer. How long can you sustain being off on your own without business coming in? And the reason that's important is If you have that year's worth of runway, for instance, then you can go off on your own and maybe bide your time and not really have to worry about paying the bills. So you can spend a bunch of time laying the groundwork and being choosier about only taking on consultative type of engagements, and you don't have to worry about paying your mortgage. So basically, the more runway you have, the more it might be an option to just go directly into freelancing and indiehood, versus if, in 2 weeks you have to start paying your bills again, then you're almost certainly going to have to just take a freelancing gig that looks a lot like your old job. Another concern is what do your prospects look like? So this kind of is part and parcel with the runway concern. If you, as the senior software engineer, have already lined up a few like consultative freelancing gigs, hey, that's great. You've got some real signal there. Maybe you just make the jump and go. If, on the other hand, you have absolutely no prospects, or the only prospects you have are just a freelancer flavored version of the same software engineering stuff, then that's not really something in your favor for going off on your own right away. Another thing that I would factor in here is, what is your chance of earning a promotion in your current role? And I'm distinguishing this from what would be your chance of going and getting I can't remember the term. I've been out of the world of job applications for so long, but getting, essentially not making a lateral move, but making an advancing career move. So you go from being a senior software engineer at Acme Inc. to a dev manager at Beta LLC. That's a pretty hard jump to make into management. Like, you would probably have to be on the job market for, figure up to a year before doing that. So I'm going to set aside the idea that you might jump from your current role as an individual contributor to being a leader at another company. That is not super common. What I would then, factor into your decision is, if you're looking at your company, what are the odds that you will be able to secure either a true promotion role, like becoming a manager and having reports, or a kind of like, and there's a lot of these in the software world, like a developmental title, like architect or tech lead or something, where it's kind of, I don't want to belittle anybody's like titles or whatever, but like you're not really in leadership. It's sort of like a, I can't think of the word without being rude, but like, not ceremonial. That's not what I'm going for, but it's, dotted line report. Like, so you do actually, like, the organization views you as being more authoritative and knowledgeable. Like, there is something to it, but nobody reports to you. This isn't codified in the org structure in any way. So that's another flavor of potential promotion that you could be up for. So if you think in your organization, if it's big enough, if there's enough like upward mobility from individual contributor roles that you could go into dev management, and you think that might happen, great. What's more likely is you could become an architect or a project manager, or maybe a scrum master, I guess, depending on how you think of it. If there's a role you could get into that looks more like leadership and looks more like consulting than just straight labor, that also can work for you. And the reason you want to be thinking through that is, if that path is clear to you, then you will have a clear, sunset timeline on your role. So maybe within the next year, you get a designation like architect or team lead. And then within 2-3 years, you could think about trying to parlay that into a more consultative flavored piece of indiehood. So those are the factors I would put in. Runway and prospects is going to, the more of those things you have, the more it's reasonable to take the plunge. On the flip side of that, the more options you have within your current organization, the more opportunities for growth, maybe the less likely you want to immediately make the indie plunge. So let me get further into each one of these paths instead of kind of like, option weighing. So let's take the path of get promoted first. Like, let's say that's what you're leaning towards, and that's what seems to make the most sense. So the first thing that I would do, given that your path, if you decide to stay employed before taking the jump, is going to be very harmonious with your organization's advancement plan for you. And what I mean is, if you're working for a dev manager, or, in whatever you're personally doing, if you're watching this and maybe you're not a developer, but if you're working for a manager, you're an individual contributor, the sort of incumbent default assumption that everybody has is you're going to work there forever. So they're going to probably, if they're an established organization, be asking you where you see yourself in a few years, what you want your career development plan to look like. That's just what a good boss would do. They want to keep you engaged and growing. They're going to be looking at, over the long haul, developing you into leadership roles, potentially, if that's what you want. And that is fine, because that's also what you're looking to do. So nothing about your goal would set off any flags with the organization. I mean, you don't have to tell them that you want to, in 3 years or whatever, go off on your own, but you can just say, I want to earn advancement. I'm hoping within a few years to be a dev manager here or something. Perfectly reasonable to tell them. And they might even come back and set out a path towards that goal with you. And that is absolutely great. So the first thing that I would do is try to make your goals clear to your management in a very honest and transparent way. I want to be doing more systems thinking type stuff. I want to be doing more consultative stuff. I want to be more involved in strategy. I want to get in on those conversations and eventually become a manager. You can explain all that to them and they can work with you on making that happen. So that's the absolute day zero thing that I would do, is just make that intention clear, get some feedback, and see what that path looks like for you. Now, it's quite likely, if you're working somewhere, that there's going to be a bunch of software engineers all reporting to the same dev manager, and that role doesn't open up every day. So they might say something to you like, well, sure, let's look at that long term, but realistically, we're probably not going to have a role like that for you for another 5-8 years. And I'm guessing you don't have this long of a runway. I don't have the email up in front of me, but I don't think we were talking about 8 years. So assuming that case isn't immediately accessible, then maybe you could say well, okay, what are the interim stepping stones? What would I have to do in order to be a tech lead? And that might be something that, because it can be a role, a situational role on projects, maybe they give that to you sooner. So set your sights on that. And then finally, this doesn't need to be something necessarily that's conferred on you. So you could look to just pile up relevant experience. And what I mean is, you don't need to be a tech lead or a dev manager or something to ask, hey, I'm kind of interested in project management. Could I sit in on the project management organization's meetings, anywhere that you feel like it's appropriate for me to participate? I'm not, I just kind of want to learn and understand the ropes. I want to understand what this is about. So you could volunteer to be cross-functional with other concerns of the business, like project management, product management, maybe the architecture group, anywhere that these concerns aren't having closed door meetings. You can certainly sit in and absorb that information and learn. If you do that long enough, they might ask you to participate. So basically look for ways to volunteer. You could also, think about offering up to do things like process audits. Can we make our instance of Jira here more efficient in terms of how we're logging work, that type of thing. The key thing to mention is all of this, you want to be very clear that it's above and beyond your day-to-day duties. You don't want to go in and say, hey, how about instead of, the software engineering that you're paying me to do, I do these other things because I want to put, that I'm a leader on my resume. Don't do that. But genuinely auditing these other business concerns in your spare time to learn. And if you're lucky, in the beginning, contribute, but probably if you're sitting there and, participating by just absorbing it and maybe asking the occasional question, sooner or later, they'll probably involve you. And that can be a very easy path towards legitimately participating in more strategic aspects of the business. So that's really, I think, going to be your path if your goal, or if the path you take is organizational promotion first, and then going off on your own. And by the way, as you're doing all this volunteering and trying to kind of advance your own career within that company to make you more attractive as a consultant, absolutely also be keeping in mind what you want your practice to look like and what kind of services and consulting you would offer, and be refining that, maybe even standing up your own website. So keep those two things in sync. Feed what you're learning in these conversations back into your prospective business, and volunteer for the right kinds of meetings or things that you might do, kind of driven by what you want your practice to look like. So make those two things kind of work together for you. That is what I would do if you are going to go the promotion route first. If you're going to go the indie route first, in some senses, this is easier, Because once you go off on your own, you kind of get to do whatever you decide you want to do. It's just a question of whether you can sell that to organizations. So the easy thing is that you can just immediately declare that you're a strategic consultant and only accept work that will kind of align with that. So you just start turning down freelance programming work and say, no, I don't do that anymore. I'm a leader. I'm a consultant. That isn't worth my time, et cetera. The challenge there is that's going to be hard to sell if your entire background is just slinging code. And again, this is why I was kind of talking about runway and lining up prospects and stuff first, because, if you have the runway and if you have some prospects, then you can bridge that gap and just, go on with your life doing strategic things, and great. If you don't have those things, then you run the risk of going off on your own and either having to kind of say, oh, okay, I'm going to go on Upwork and freelance, or just go back to your job. So it really has to do with the likelihood of success. But if you decide you want to go indie at first, thinking about your runway and thinking about what your plan is, you could then divide up the kind of work that you're trying to get into the desired, the aspirational consulting work, and the pay the bills work. What I mean is maybe you build a website that's really oriented around doing freelance application development, but you have some kind of landing page for a discovery process audit or something you put up that's consultative, or maybe you even build a separate site. And you can then control as you go along, like, okay, I'm going to take on a lot of app dev work to pay the bills, but I'm also going to, in a handful of hours each week, I'm going to carve out some time to try to grow this well-positioned consulting practice. So that's a good tactic to undertake. The more that you can solve a problem and identify a niche, by the way, the more likely it is you're going to get consultative type work. And the more likely it is you're going to avoid this kind of like grading, coder joust industrial complex of software engineers all arguing about what good code is. If you are getting hired on because you say that, you're a Python developer, what's going to happen when you go and do freelance work for an organization is they're going to treat you like a job candidate. And they're going to say, well, we'll just see how good a Python developer you are. We'll have our staff Python developers run you through a series of code exercises, and they'll be the judge of whether you know what you're doing or not. But if you could go to that same organization and say, hey, I can do a series of things to your website that's going to increase your profit by 20%. I promise you they will not care whatsoever what their Python engineers think of your programming or whatever. Nobody will care what you're doing under the hood if you can truly deliver them a 20% increase in profits. So what I'm getting at is when you're standing up your practice and when you're thinking about a productized service or something that you can do, the more you do a listening tour and kind of discover a niche and a need in your prospective partners in your business, your prospective clients, the less this all becomes relevant. They're not going to be grading your labor. So what I'm getting at here is if you're going to go the indie route, ideally you've got a lot of runway, you've got some prospects, and you will have more time to do this, but you want to do a listening tour. You want to start to talk to people, discover a niche, discover needs that aren't being met, discover outcomes that people want that aren't being delivered, and start to try to build an offering or productized services around those things. And that is going to make it less likely that people are going to be grading you on the basis of how you conduct yourself while doing labor. And also gonna, just bypass that whole kind of conversation. By the way, being good at delivering outcomes will also inherently make you more of an expert and a consultative type of presence. So if you're going to go the indie route, in summary, view freelance app dev or freelance technicianing of whatever flavor you are, if you're watching this, view that as a way to pay the bills while you're doing the work of trying to discover niches and outcomes and how to offer those outcomes as deliverables as an expert. So you kind of want to be always doing that market research and iterating and trying to move away from the labor and towards the strategy or the strategic outcome that you deliver. In the end, I guess the last piece of advice that I will give, this has gotten kind of long, is all things being equal, what would I do? I would try to go the indie route first. I just think that's better, which is ironic given that I actually went the work your way up the org chart and then go indie route. But if I could go back and give myself advice as, a corporate citizen in their 20s, because it was throughout my 20s. In my early 30s, I went off on my own, but I kind of worked my way up the org chart in my 20s and early 30s and then went indie. But if I could go back and talk to 20-something Eric, who at that time had no intention of leaving the corporate world, and that age Eric in his 20s was interested in going off on his own, I'd say it's way easier to go off on your own and kind of work your way from being a freelancer delivering services like app dev to being a consultant if you're intentional about it. And the reason for that is just the way that corporate structures exist. They're shaped like pyramids, which means that each time you want to go up the organization, there's just way fewer opportunities. So in the corporate world, to advance, you're going to have to do a lot of biding of your time or aggressively job hopping and kind of managing that system. It's a much more fluid, open-ended path if you're an indie to start saying, well, okay, I'm going to start out delivering labor, and then I'm going to keep my ears open and listen to why people want this labor, what outcomes they're trying to deliver, and then to learn how to deliver those outcomes and kind of work my way up the org chart. It's way easier to give yourself promotions as an indie business owner than it is to earn them in the corporate world. So you're going to be able to advance a lot more quickly if you go indie first. So that is the route I would go. Anyway, I hope that answers this now 3-year-old question, and hopefully that's sort of interesting, and I will catch you all next time.